everyone. It's Christina Herrick, produce editor with The Packer, here again with another Tip of the Iceberg podcast. In this episode, we're talking biocontrols, and I'm joined by Pam Marrone, co-founder and executive chair of the Invasive Species Corporation. And Pam has a long history in biocontrol, so I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me, Pam.
Great to be here. Yes, this is my fourth biological startup, so happy to chat.
Yeah, so I wanted to start at the basics. So I use the word and the term biocontrols to kind of cover a lot of different things within the biologicals world. So, let's start there. Am I using the right term? Should I call everything biocontrols? What is biocontrols? What does that mean? Let's start there first.
It can be a bit confusing because the terminology is often different outside the U.S. versus the U.S. because so biocontrols can mean classical biocontrols like bugs, that lady beetles and predatory mites. Okay, that's classical biocontrol, controlling one bug to control another bug. Or it can mean biopesticides, which are materials sprayed on to crops. They can be microorganisms or biochemicals, soaps, fatty acids, extracts of plants, and then microbials, microorganisms that are registered by the EPA as biopesticides.
Yeah, that's kind of why I stick with biocontrols, because it's kind of, in my mind, it's kind of that umbrella term for everything. Right. And then we can kind of go into, and I know there's bionematicides. There's so many different subcategories in there. So one thing I thought is kind of interesting, and I'm asking this question because when I've worked on stories in the past on biocontrols, a lot of times people think biocontrols are organic or organics are biocontrols, and sometimes they interchange those. And I say people generally. I don't think growers, obviously, that use the products get this confused, but I do think, sometimes maybe consumers. So what are the differences? Can a biological be organic and vice versa?
Yes. And this is confusing. So often biocontrols or biopesticides are pigeonholed as only for organic, but 70% of all biocontrols are used by conventional farmers who also use chemicals. So they're very broadly used and not just for organic, but most biocontrols or biopesticides are listed as organic. But there are some natural materials that are not registered as biologicals or biopesticides, but are organic. So, for example, spinosins and pyganic, so the pyrethrums are materials that are natural and organic, listed as organic, but are registered as chemicals, even though they're natural materials, because they have a toxic mode of action to the pest. So it can get confusing. So not all organic materials, organic pesticides are biological pesticides and registered as biologicals. Some are registered as chemicals.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that's also kind of the challenge within the biocontrol industry, is just trying to get across what are biocontrol products, what they do, the benefits, and we'll get into some of the benefits soon. But I thought another good place, kind of in the starting point of this conversation, is just to talk about how long biocontrols have been in use in the fresh produce industry. Obviously, for those people who recognize your last name, they'll recognize Marrone Bio, and they'll understand, you've got a long tie to the produce industry. So, you can kind of...
Or if they're really old, they'll recognize AgriQuest and Serenade. That was my second company,
Yeah, well, we'll have to talk about that in a little bit, too, because I really want to hear kind of about your genesis. But so let's talk about use in the produce industry. It's to me, it's not something new. I know they've been around for a long time. So talk about some of the biocontrols that have been in the fresh produce industry and how long they've been in use, and then maybe give us some examples of maybe something that our viewers and listeners may not even realize is a biocontrol product that's commonly used now.
Yeah, there's more biologicals used in produce than in any other category, and it's why because you can manage residues. Most all, if not all, biologicals are exempt from residue MRLs, maximum residue level. So because of that, you can have a problem come in late. You can spray, harvest, export, and you have a very short pre-harvest interval and a very short field reentry. So these are very labor saving and friendly things, which the produce industry really likes. And more recently, liking the fact that you don't harm beneficials, you can have better biodiversity in the field, improve soil health, but at the same time, actually increase yield and quality. Typically, when biologicals are incorporated into programs, you see better quality and pest management than with chemical only programs because of that synergy of the modes of action. So there's quite a lot of biologicals used in produce. So you've got your biofungicides. So you've got your products that are bacillus based, and there's a lot of bacillus products. Some well-known brands which I developed are Serenade and Sonata, but there are many others. Double Nickel is another real prominent one by Certus, Serafel by BSF. So ever increasing number of bacillus. Why? Bacillus is a rich mine of fungicidal microorganisms and compounds produced by the bacillus, and each strain is different. So when a company comes up with a new bacillus, it's not exactly the same as another company's bacillus that might have different spectrum. So some control foliar diseases, some are better at controlling soil diseases. So you're going to continue to see this to be a pretty crowded and busy category. And then you've got your bioinsecticides. So you've got both microbes and, let's go back to the biofungicides. On the biofungicides, you don't have just microbes used in fresh produce. You also have natural substances which are called biochemicals by the EPA. And these can be extracts of plants or soaps and so forth. And so there's a number of those products out there. An example, of course, I use from my own, developed at Marrone Bio, is Regalia, which is an extract of knotweed. So that's a natural substance or a biochemical. Now, in the insecticide side, you've got bioinsecticides. You've got all kinds of microbes. You've got fungi, and you've got bacteria, and actinomycetes. So there's 3 different categories. And then you've got your biochemicals or your natural substances. And why is it like that? Because there's 2 divisions at the EPA, one for the biochemicals and one for microbials. So that's how they're categorized. What would be some good examples? Neem is an example of a natural plant substance that's used as a biological. And then some microbes. You've got PFR from Certus, which is a fungus. You've got Venerate, which is a new species of bacteria from Marrone Bio. And there's a lot more out there.
Yeah, well, I think that was a good overview of some of the different segments, and then also some of the names that maybe our viewers and listeners may be using, and maybe they know that they're biological, maybe they don't. I do think that's one of the interesting things.
I forgot to mention bionematicides. That is an emerging category.
Yes.
And there's an increasing number of products coming out in that arena, and badly needed. I keep hearing the almond board saying that they need more nematicides, and we do, especially with the demise of the fumigants, and you can't use fumigants as much anymore. So that's where there's a big need. But there are Melocon, which is a Certus product, and then Magistine, Marrone Bio, and Marrone Bio has a new one coming that's an amped up product. It's got a different new name. And then Plant Healthcare just launched one. The name escapes me, but another nematicide. So they're coming, ever increasing ones. Yeah.
So then, do biostimulants fall under this, or is that just like a whole another category into
If you're going to say biologicals in general, then yes, biostimulants would cover that. If you're talking about biocontrols, no, because they control pests. So that's a separate category. True. Biostimulants. So if we go back a step and say biologicals, what are they? Biocontrol or biopesticides, biostimulants, which increase crop growth and reduce stress, but don't control pests. And number 3, bionutrients provide crop nutrition, NPK, micronutrients. Okay. Those are the 3 major categories.
Yeah. And see, I mean, even me, I've been doing how many stories on biocontrols and biologicals, and even I'm, getting biostimulants thrown in biocontrols when obviously, as you mentioned, the mode of action is in the word.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it is confusing, and that's the thing. Most of the surveys I see, farmer surveys, say this education and awareness and confusion is actually a big barrier to adoption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, so I'm going to hop around questions, but what can the industry do to kind of build on that kind of? I don't want to say prevent disinformation, but kind of help educate better and help bring on that widespread adoption.
Well, Western growers, I'm working with Western growers on a biologicals initiative that's now gone global to do on-farm vetting of biologicals to help farmers learn how to use them. And that's really critical because there's small plot tests done by university, which is fine. But then if that stops and then there's never the translation from those tiny little small plots to more realistic farmer fields, then you have a huge gap in how to use the products properly, because small plot tests do not tell you how necessarily how that biological is going to be performing on a farm, in a system, in a program where farmer uses multiple practices and tools. So I'm really glad to see Western growers is doing that. And we just got finished with the Salinas Biological Summit, which was fantastic. Mm-hmm. And the whole purpose of the summit, this is year 2, is exactly this question, how to bridge that gap, because the surveys are still showing 50% of farmers don't have a clue about biologicals. But once they know they try them and know how to use them, they rate them very highly because of all the benefits they have, which I have named. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, some of what, when I've done stories on biologicals and biocontrols, I do understand there's a little bit of a different type of management strategy. And I realize this is a very broad question talking about products that are all kind of different with maybe different modes. But, talk to me a little bit about that. So you kind of talked about the difference between a small test plot and then going on to a more more farm-like setting in terms of understanding how those products work. And then maybe talk a little bit about, what that means for different management strategies and what might be different for a grower that might be used to a conventional product versus a biological. What does that mean for them?
Yeah, so a small plot test, might be 5 branches on an almond tree or a 10-foot row or something of lettuce or something. So that, and it might be inoculated, actually, an artificial where the researchers actually putting out the disease or something. So that tells you what the product does under the most severe conditions. And this is why biologicals get a reputation they don't work as well as chemicals. But that's not entirely true, because then when you translate that over to a realistic situation, sometimes you do have disease or pests that severe, but most of the time you don't. But also the modes of action of biologicals are very different than chemicals and often prevent disease or prevent the buildup of pests. So you use them early in the season. They might stop feeding or stop development of the pest, even though the pest doesn't die. And even if there's more leaf spots, per square inch or per leaf, the yields and quality may be the same or better than the chemical only program. So that is the key, is to go beyond counting the number of pests or the number of leaf spots on a little tiny plot to, what is the grower care about? Yield and quality, right? Marketable yield and quality. So those tests are expensive. And so what companies do, and this is why Western Growers is working on this, is then do demos on the farm where you have your standard program. Okay, maybe it's all conventional typically, and then although in produce you got pretty high penetration of biologicals. So, and then you have a block that is incorporated in the biological. What does that mean? Integrated in. It could be a tank mix, or it could be a rotation. And so, or it could be just using the biological in the first part of the season and at the end to manage residues. Or it could be used throughout the season to reduce the chance that the chemicals will develop resistance. So you can delay resistance develop and manage resistance by incorporating in a biological with a different mode of action. So those are how you can do. So you do a block with this biological incorporated in that way, and then you look at compare that to what your standard program is, and over time we see very, very happy farmers with the results.
Yeah, and I think, it just boils down to the farmer understanding that, maybe I don't want to say the applications are different, but like you said, it may be something where if you're using a biocontrol that's supposed to attack a pest, it might stop the growth as opposed to just killing it dead, where some conventional products that might be the mode of action that. So, yeah, I think that's kind of part of it. And I do think sometimes it's timing, right? I do think there's some application timing that's a little different, where maybe a conventional product might be a little bit more forgiving, where with a biological, you really have to.
A lot of conventional products are systemic. So they're going to be more forgiving, whereas biologicals are preventative and they're not systemic. So the timing is critical. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you miss that window to get that pest at a young stage where it might be more vulnerable, you might not be able to actually have a successful treatment with the product. Yes.
I do know companies that are addressing that with tech. So they're doing real-time detection of pests or pathogens, and that way you can predict when to spray more accurately, and that really helps with the performance. Yeah,
that's interesting. I mean, it makes sense, and it's something I think that there's I know enough disease or websites and calculators and things like that. So the technology is there. It seems like it would be a perfect solution, or at least a perfect help for those farmers that maybe need the extra hand in understanding that application window.
Well, degree day models, though, are no longer relevant because what happened in the past is no longer predictive.
That's true. That's very true. Good point.
Doing real-time PCR in the field where you're actually detecting when the pathogen is actually there is probably even better.
Yeah, that's a good point. You kind of talked earlier about this, the Invasive Species Corp being your fourth startup. So, I think this is a kind of an interesting segue to kind of talk about. You've shared kind of all your wealth of knowledge about biologicals and biocontrols. So I'd love to get kind of where your journey is and how you found yourself into biologicals, and kind of where your startups have been, and just share a little bit about your career and some of those innovations some that you've already mentioned.
Well, I'm a bit weird because I wanted to be an entomologist since I was about 10. And I grew up on 40 acres in southern Connecticut, most beautiful place. And the spongy moths, they used to be called gypsy moths. Spongy moths would ravage the trees. And I said, well, there's got to be something to help these. And my father actually used the first ever commercialized biological control, and that is BT, still on the market today and still one of the biggest categories. And so I found it when he died. I went in the garage and I actually found a jug of some old BT, and he sprayed it, and he wasn't sure how it worked, whether it worked well. He said, well, I don't know if it works, but it's certainly good for the environment. So that's kind of how that really says it. And it got me interested in this. So I was pretty obsessed and went to start my career at Monsanto. They hired me to find a new unit, to start a new unit looking for new ways to control pests. And I set up the first microbe natural product screening program and screened thousands, hundreds of thousands of microbes way ahead of my time, before microbes were really trendy. And so fell in love with that. And then was recruited by, at the time, a very obscure Danish company, Novo Nordisk, now quite famous company for their obesity drugs. They were just a tiny little company back then. They hired me to set up a company in Davis, California. That's how I got to California, which we called Entotech. And that was the first one. And we were working on BTs, but we were also screening new microbes. I screened over 50,000 microbes. And then they sold us to our largest competitor when they had some issues in their other businesses. And I started up AgriQuest. Discovered Serenade from a peach orchard in Fresno County. And it is the biggest biofungicide sold today. And it is sold by Bayer now, which acquired AgriQuest. I started up Marrone Bio in 2006 and retired in quotes in 2020, and then had a 3-year hiatus of non-compete. And with my co-founder, who was also the president and CFO of Marrone Bio, we started up again. Why? One of the things we really want to tackle is weed control. And although we got part of the way there, and I always told Dave Eddy that I was going to find a bioherbicide before I retired, and I'm still determined to do it. So I had to start up a new company to do so. So we're screening microbes, looking for natural products that can control weeds. It's a big, big area. Bioherbicides are teeny, less than $200 million sold globally compared to $6 billion for biocontrols. So biocontrol is becoming a big category. It's 10% of all pesticides now. So, why should you care about biologicals? Because the predictions are by 2040, biological in size, the market in size will be equal to chemicals, because chemicals are only growing 5% a year. Biologicals are growing 10 to 20. So they're going to cross over at some point. Anyway, so that's how I got to the Invasive Species Corporation. We're also working on controlling invasive zebra and quagga mussels in water and invasive carp in water. So we have licensed some technology, one from my old company, Equinox from my old company, and one from the USGS for the carp. Yeah.
That's interesting. And I do think it's a great point. And I almost asked the why should people care question in my questions that I was sending over to you, but I almost thought that was too, too pointed. But I do think it's an important point that you bring up, is that people should care. As you kind of alluded to, resistance management is going to be the name of the game moving forward. And, for conventional products, that's obviously something that, that's why new AIs are trying to be developed, just to chase that, so that we prevent resistance management.
There's 9 new active ingredients going through the EPA on the chemical side. There's 80 new active ingredients going through the biopesticide division. Okay.
So, I mean, is that, like you said, just because that's kind of where science is leading? Or
Yeah. And so EPA had to set up a new emerging technologies branch to deal with genetically engineered microbes, and they're coming, and genetically engineered insects for disease control, and gene edited insects, for insect control. And so we're getting into a lot of new technologies. And so it's exciting. It's exciting time, but that also can overwhelm farmers with how many individual companies and small companies there are in this industry. So I have some advice, and that is, how do you distinguish a good company from a bugs in a jug bathtub brew company? Okay. What data do they have? How robust is the data package? Okay. That is really critical. If they have one trial or 2 trials, forget it. But if they have 50 trials, 100 trials, and it's good, solid data. And do they know the motive? Do they know how the product works? And explain how the product works, and it's precise use instructions. Okay.
Yeah.
You know when it works and when it doesn't work. What are the conditions where it actually doesn't perform well? That's really critical. And timing. What's the best crop phenology? Is it affected by any soil conditions or weather, or all the use instructions? So companies that can articulate that, that's farmers should listen to those. But the ones that are, I've got this jug that's got 10, 20, 60 microbes in it, And, and then I asked them, I said, well, do you know what all 60 are doing? Not really. Well, how are you going to explain that to a farmer? Well, we know it works. Well, that's not good enough. So, yeah, but they're out there. Yeah. Those companies. And the problem with that is that it does confuse the farmer. Yeah.
Well, and I think unfortunately, those companies give the biological and whole umbrella a bad rap. Yeah. Because maybe a grower might have tried one of those products and it doesn't work for them. And then they say, oh, biocontrols or biologicals don't work at all. Yeah. I don't want to use them. And that happens a lot. And I do think sometimes there's a little bit of this, is it too good to be true kind of conversation? And sometimes I think that could be the case too. Even with biologicals that do what they say they can do, sometimes it's almost too good to be true.
Yeah, yes, the realistic expectations, like I said, when it does and when it doesn't work, and is really critical. That consistency of performance is so critical, because you don't want to use it once and it works and it doesn't, then the next time it doesn't, and that really turns off anywhere you go in the world. Any farmer, that's their biggest gripe. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and where are farmers growing? They're growing outside in conditions that might change from time to time. Yeah. So that also makes, trying to set them up for success a little bit of a challenge if you're not precise, as you alluded to, with knowing exactly when it works and when it doesn't work, and when you shouldn't apply it. I think, those are important things. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's really great advice. So, what else should our listeners and viewers know, and kind of understanding that, our readership and listenership kind of spans the entire fresh produce spectrum. So from grower all the way to retailer and everywhere in between. So, what should they understand about biocontrols? Are there questions they should, like a retailer should be asking a grower about product use? Are there conversations that should be had? Or, what are some things that our listeners and viewers should think about?
Well, one of the things is that there is lots of new technology coming. And so it's going to be a bit overwhelming. But this is good because, especially where I am in California, and one of the reasons we started this Western Growers Initiative is that on biologicals is that growers are saying, look, if you're going to take away my chemicals, what are the alternatives? And then you go to the extension specialist and they go, I don't know about these. I haven't tested these biologicals. I haven't tested them. When I tested them, it didn't work. Right? So there's that huge gap. So, bridging that gap is the important thing. There are a lot of biologicals out there. There's exciting new technologies coming that are going to have even more solutions. So then the key is, okay, how do we get them used? I mean, from the retailer's perspective, the retailers like the biological tools because you can manage residues. You can be the consumer at the end of the day is what's driving biologicals, and so that's really helpful. But when it comes to on-farm practice, that's not where the retailer is. Is really at except on food safety, but I mean in terms of crop inputs, you don't see that. That's where they're acting. So, but certainly anyone who was influencing the grower, for sure. And again, the real thing is that education piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of hit the end of my question. The one I was going to ask is like the future of biocontrols, but I think you've already kind of talked about that, what's coming, and there's a lot of exciting things coming. So I don't know, is there anything else in the future that
I will mention a few things that are coming that are two big new categories. So there's RNAi. So RNA interference, just like we have COVID vaccines based on that technology. You can control virtually any pest or pathogen by interfering with its RNA machinery. And so there is so much research, hundreds and hundreds of professors around the globe working on how to control their favorite pest or pathogen or weed with RNA interference. So you're going to see companies coming out. So the first one that was registered by EPA was Colorado potato beetle by Greenlight Biosciences. And you're going to see more. There's a whole plethora in a pipeline of this. And then the other big category are what's called peptides. And this is basically, again, with tools like artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can design a way to control any pest using peptides, which are strings of proteins together. And so there's a lot of companies working in this area. So we're going to have precision pest management even more so in this arena in the future. The downside is they're more like chemicals, and therefore pests will develop resistance to them because they're single mode of action. And so therefore they're going to have to be used, and as I would recommend anyway, in holistic integrated pest management programs.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about this as you were talking that, I definitely should get you back on the podcast to even talk a little bit more about the bioherbicides that you're working on, or just kind of that part of it. Because I do think that's really interesting, is like, how do you approach a problem almost not necessarily, well, I guess literally from the ground up or below the ground up, right? But I think that would be really interesting. And then to just hear a little bit more about the new technologies coming out.
Well, I will mention bioherbicides. So there's only a few companies working on bioherbicides. Yeah. Why? It's technically very challenging to get a biological solution to compete at the cost and the broad spectrum of chemicals. So, but there's Harpy bioherbicide that's coming up with new mint oil things. And then there's a number of companies searching for microbes. And what I'm doing is looking for not just the microbe, but the natural products, the compounds produced by the microbe. And they're out there. But we have new tools today that can help us ferment microbes and grow them in fermentation at a lower cost. So we can sequence the genes of a microorganism and find out all about what the microbe is doing, and so that can help us with lowering the cost. So then there's lots of companies with new formulation technology, like AgroSpheres is one that's got some pretty cool encapsulation, and there's Aqua Yield that has nanotechnology. So there's a number of formulations. So I think you're going to see this convergence that's going to help us in the next 5 years with some bioherbicides.
That's really interesting, and just kind of hearing what you're looking to develop and kind of where you're going. It is, it's fascinating to me, because I do think this is an emerging area, and I think the more, as you said, kind of we can use AI and we can use some of the new tools, not necessarily new, maybe more readily accessible tools. Yeah. The better that will speed up the development process. So. Awesome.
AI hasn't so far been able to help me find a new microbe from nature, and bioprospect the world, help me with bioprospecting, but it can help me find a better microbe of one that already exists. So maybe a version of a herbicidal microbe, and that has it's producing higher levels of certain compounds or whatever. I'm just there. We have only found such a teeny percent of the microorganisms that live here in nature that are pesticidal or reduce crop stress, or and so I'm still a big fan of bioprospecting. So looking for microbes from nature that can control pests and weeds. And that in 5 months' time of my new company, we already have microbes that kill toxic. We're looking for algicide. An algicide control some weeds, and we also have a project funded by the state of Washington to control a shrimp problem in their oyster beds. So in 5 months' time, we've already found microbes that control all three of those, and so we're very excited about going out to nature and finding these things.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I definitely want to bring you back on the podcast in a little bit of time, just to talk more about biologicals and just some of the developments that you're working on that you can talk about. I know there's probably a lot in development that you may not want to talk about, but we can talk across the road.
But
I just appreciate you taking some time to talk to me. I feel like we scratched the surface, so maybe we could take a deeper dive with biologicals next time, because, we talked a lot about categories and a lot broad terms, and maybe we can get a little bit more into the education the next time you're on too.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. And get into more specifics. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining me. And, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. It does, like I said earlier, it really does impress me with just how much science goes into the products. Obviously, I know there's a lot of science that goes into the products, but, when with biologicals, there's so much precision and so much research and development that goes into these products that it's really interesting to just kind of hear where things have come, and that it's not a new thing either.
No, and that's the thing. If you used a biological 5 years ago, you got to try them again, because science and technology is changing so fast. We have new tools to improve the products now. As I said, formulation, fermentation, and so strain improvement. So a product is now probably version 4.0 when it was version 1.0 5 years ago. So that's the thing with biologicals. You can keep improving them, and it's worth looking at them again. If you've tried them and it didn't work, some years ago, it's worth trying them again.
Well, that's a great elevator pitch. I should have included that as a question. Just give us your elevator pitch for using it. But I think you've done a great job of that already, which is awesome. When I was thinking of who I wanted to talk to for biologicals, you were the first one to come to mind, because I thought, who better to talk to about biological products, their use, their role in the produce industry than Pam Marrone. And so, I do thank you so much again for just, coming on the podcast, joining me here, and kind of starting the conversation about biologicals.
Yeah, one thing we have to talk about next time is the ability using biologicals to improve soil health and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
Those are I think big new emerging benefits of biologicals. And I think those are really important. Those clearly are very important for the produce industry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring you back on. We could, maybe we might have to do this twice or more. We could talk soil health, because I do think, I don't want to shortcut soil health, where I think soil health needs to be almost its own conversation. And then we could have maybe some research and development conversations later. So
that's a big category, but it's really obviously really important.
Yeah.
And we're learning every day more and more about what microbes do and how plants signal microbes and attract them to the plants, and then help them. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. I mean, especially for, a lot of the more permanent crops, you've got to care about soil health. Well, you're in it for the long run.
I mean, there's some great work out of UC Davis showing that with berries, that different strawberry varieties are recruiting different microbes, and that helps them resist soil diseases. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Pam, for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I love when I have someone on the podcast that I feel like I could talk to for a long time, because then I know I want to bring you back on the podcast to talk even more. So I think we've got some great topics to talk about next time.
Well, I'd love to come back, and I never, as you can tell, I never tire of talking about biologicals.
Well, that's why you're the perfect guest. So I also want to thank our viewers and listeners for tuning in. And if you like what you hear, you can catch new episodes of Tip of the Iceberg on your favorite podcast platform like Google, Spotify, Apple, and more. And that's a wrap for this edition of Tip of the Iceberg, brought to you by the Packer, Produce Market Guide, and Farm Journal. Join us again soon for more industry insights. Bye.